June 19, 1944, 10:36 hours, 60 miles west of Guam. The Grumman F6F Hellcats that climbed through 15,000 feet that morning carried modifications that would shatter 3 years of Japanese air superiority in the Pacific. The Americans called them the Zero Killers. The Japanese would soon call them Shino Tsubasa, Wings of Death. These carrier-based fighters would shoot down 270 enemy aircraft in a single afternoon, transforming the myth of the invincible Zero into a death sentence for its pilots. What followed was not just an aerial victory, but a complete psychological collapse of Japanese naval aviation dominance that had terrorized Allied forces since Pearl Harbor. The battle that would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot represented the culmination of 18 months of desperate American innovation against an enemy that had owned the skies. The Japanese Mitsubishi A6M Zero had reigned supreme since its combat debut over China in August 1940. When Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya led 43 Zeros in the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, American pilots encountered a fighter that could outmaneuver, outclimb, and outrange anything in the Allied arsenal. The Zero could cruise at 280 miles per hour, reach altitudes of 33,000 feet, and execute turns that would stall any American fighter attempting to follow. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, Zeros decimated American Wildcat fighters with impunity. At Midway 1 month later, despite the American tactical victory, Zero pilots maintained their individual superiority in dogfights. American pilots coined a grim phrase, "Never dogfight a Zero." The mathematics of aerial combat had been brutally simple. Japanese fighters held every advantage except one that didn't matter yet: armor protection. Lieutenant Commander John Toch's Toch-Weave defensive formation had helped F-4F Wildcat fighters survive encounters with Zeros, but survival wasn't victory. American pilots were fighting defensively, trying not to die rather than seeking to kill. The Zero's dominance stemmed from a philosophical choice by chief designer Jiro Horikoshi: sacrifice everything for performance. The A6M carried no armor plating for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no redundant systems. A single .50 caliber round in the right place could doom the aircraft. But this didn't matter when Zeros could dictate the terms of every engagement. By late 1942, American carrier aviation faced a crisis. The F-4F Wildcat was obsolete. The F-4U Corsair, though powerful, had proven too difficult to land on carriers. Navy pilots needed a fighter that could match the Zero's agility while incorporating American advantages in armor, firepower, and technology. The solution would emerge from Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation on Long Island, where engineers had studied every Zero engagement, every pilot debriefing, every captured aircraft component. Roy Grumman's design team had access to something invaluable: a nearly intact Zero that had crash-landed in the Aleutian Islands in June 1942. Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga's A6M2 had flipped during an emergency landing on Akutan Island, killing the pilot, but leaving the aircraft remarkably preserved. American recovery teams had shipped it to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, where test pilots flew it extensively, documenting every strength and weakness. The Hellcat that would emerge from this analysis represented a complete rethinking of fighter design philosophy. Where the Zero sacrificed protection for performance, the Hellcat would prove that American industrial might could deliver both.
The challenge facing American naval aviation in early 1943 was unlike any other in military history. The Japanese had not simply built a superior fighter, they had created an entire tactical doctrine around the Zero's capabilities that had proven unbeatable for 30 months of continuous combat. Zero pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy were not merely skilled, they were the product of the most rigorous selection and training program in the world. Before Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval aviators required 700 flight hours before assignment to carriers. American pilots typically had 200 to 300 hours. The Japanese training pipeline was so selective that only 100 pilots graduated annually from a pool of thousands of candidates. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, who would survive the war with 64 confirmed kills, represented the typical Japanese ace: fanatical dedication, supreme confidence, and years of combat experience dating back to China in 1938. These pilots had perfected tactics that exploited every advantage of their aircraft. They knew the Zero could outturn any American fighter at any speed. They knew it could climb faster and reach higher altitudes. They used this knowledge with lethal precision. The tactical mathematics were devastating. In a turning fight, the Zero's lighter weight and lower wing loading meant it could complete a 360-degree turn in 16 seconds at combat speeds. The F4F Wildcat required 22 seconds. In aerial combat, those 6 seconds meant death. American pilots who attempted to turn with Zeros rarely survived long enough to report their mistake. The Zero's Sakai radial engine, though producing only 940 horsepower compared to the Wildcat's 1,200, propelled a fighter that weighed 1,000 pounds less. The power-to-weight ratio favored Japanese pilots in every vertical maneuver. American pilots learned through bitter experience that climbing to escape a Zero was suicide. The Japanese fighter would simply follow, firing as it climbed. Range presented another impossible challenge. The Zero's internal fuel capacity of 156 gallons, combined with its exceptional fuel efficiency, gave it a combat radius exceeding 1,000 miles. American fighters struggled to reach 400 miles. This meant Japanese fighters could escort bombers to targets far beyond American capability, and more critically, could loiter over battle areas while American fighters had to break off and return to carriers. By early 1943, the kill ratio told the story with brutal clarity. For every Zero shot down, Japanese pilots were claiming 3 to 4 American aircraft. These weren't propaganda numbers. American commanders confirmed them through pilot losses. The U.S. Navy was losing experienced aviators faster than training programs could replace them. Intelligence reports from across the Pacific painted an even grimmer picture. Japanese manufacturing was producing Zeros at accelerating rates. Mitsubishi and Nakajima factories were delivering 300 aircraft monthly. American industrial capacity was greater, but quantity meant nothing when quality resulted in 3-to-1 loss ratios. The psychological impact on American carrier pilots was measured in pilot replacement requests. Squadrons were reporting combat fatigue at unprecedented rates. Pilots were requesting transfers to less dangerous assignments. The confident young aviators who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor were being ground down by an enemy they couldn't match in fair combat. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific, received classified assessments that made clear the strategic implications. Without air superiority, the island-hopping campaign toward Japan would stall. Every amphibious landing required carrier air cover. Every supply convoy needed fighter protection. The Zero's dominance was becoming a strategic constraint on the entire Pacific War effort. American tactical doctrine had devolved into pure defensiveness. Official fighter tactics manuals from 1942 to 1943 read like survival guides rather than combat instruction. Avoid turning combat with Zeros. Only use diving attacks. Never attempt to climb away from a Zero. Maintain altitude advantage at all costs. These were the tactics of an Air Force that had accepted inferiority. The Japanese, meanwhile, had grown overconfident. Captured documents and interrogated pilots revealed a dangerous arrogance. They believed American pilots lacked the warrior spirit for aerial combat. They dismissed American fighters as inferior by design, rather than acknowledging tactical adaptation. This confidence would prove fatal. But in early 1943, it appeared entirely justified by 3 years of continuous victory.
The weapon that would break Japanese air superiority was born from systematic analysis rather than inspiration. In January 1943, Grumman's chief engineer William Schwendler assembled a team with a singular mission: design a fighter that could beat the Zero using American advantages while negating Japanese strengths. The captured Akutan Zero provided the blueprint for victory. Test flights at Wright Field revealed critical weaknesses. Above 230 miles per hour, the Zero's control surfaces stiffened dramatically. In high-speed dives exceeding 300 miles per hour, the aircraft became nearly uncontrollable. The fabric-covered ailerons couldn't handle the aerodynamic forces. American pilots had been fleeing by diving away, unknowingly exploiting the Zero's greatest weakness. Grumman's team made revolutionary decisions documented in their classified design specifications from February 1943. The F6F Hellcat would be built around the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, more than twice the Zero's power. This engine weighed 2,360 pounds alone, but American industrial capacity could handle the weight penalty. The design philosophy inverted Japanese priorities. Where Zeros sacrificed protection for agility, Hellcats would accept reduced maneuverability for survivability and firepower. Armor plating weighing 212 pounds protected the pilot from front and rear attacks. Self-sealing fuel tanks added 150 pounds but prevented the catastrophic fires that doomed Zeros. Bulletproof glass windscreens, redundant control systems, and reinforced structures made the Hellcat a flying tank compared to the Zero's fragility. Firepower received obsessive attention. 6 Browning M2.5 caliber machine guns, 3 per wing, could deliver 4,800 rounds per minute of concentrated fire. Each gun carried 400 rounds of ammunition. The synchronized firing pattern meant that at 300 yards, all 6 guns converged bullets into a 3-foot circle. A 1-second burst put 80 rounds of half-inch bullets into that space. The flight test data from prototype XF6F1 in June 1942 had been promising but insufficient to ensure dominance. The production F6F3 that entered service in January 1943 incorporated 18 months of combat feedback. Maximum speed, 376 miles per hour at 17,300 feet. Rate of climb, 3,240 feet per minute. Service ceiling, 37,300 feet. Combat radius, 945 miles with drop tanks. Most critically, the Hellcat maintained control authority at all speeds. Unlike the Zero, which became sluggish above 230 miles per hour, the Hellcat's hydraulically boosted controls remained responsive at 400 miles per hour. In high-speed combat, American pilots would finally have the advantage. Naval Air Station Pocasset River in Maryland became the crucible where tactics merged with technology. Commander James Flatley, who had survived multiple Zero encounters flying Wildcats, led the fighter director school that trained the first Hellcat squadrons. The new tactics developed there reversed 3 years of defensive fighting. The new tactics exploited every Hellcat advantage. Use speed, never turn. Engage from altitude, dive through enemy formations. If a Zero gets on your tail, dive to 350 miles per hour, he cannot follow. Use wingman tactics, one engages while the other covers. Press attacks, your armor will save you, theirs won't. By April 1944, 9 carrier air groups had transitioned to Hellcats. Training emphasized aggression rather than survival. Pilots learned they could take hits that would destroy Zeros and keep fighting. They learned their 6.5 cows could saw through lightweight Japanese construction with devastating effect. The confidence gap began closing. Naval ordnance specialists developed specialized ammunition loads, armor-piercing incendiary rounds that ignited fuel tanks, tracer rounds for targeting, and standard ball ammunition. The mixture meant even glancing hits on Zeros could prove fatal. Japanese pilots' lack of protection, once an acceptable trade-off for performance, became a death sentence. The industrial mobilization behind Hellcat production dwarfed anything Japan could achieve. Grumman's Bethpage plant employed 25,000 workers, operating 24-hour shifts.
By June 1944, production reached 500 aircraft monthly. The Navy would ultimately receive 12,275 Hellcats, each one a purpose-built Zero killer incorporating lessons written in the blood of Wildcat pilots. June 19, 1944, 10:23 hours. The first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared on radar screens aboard USS Lexington, 150 miles west of Saipan. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, ordered immediate fighter launch. Within minutes, 450 Hellcats were climbing toward the incoming raid of 373 Japanese aircraft, a mix of Zeros, Judys, and Jills, representing the mobile fleet's striking power. Commander David McCampbell, leading Fighter Squadron 15 from USS Essex, positioned his division at 24,000 feet, perfectly executing the altitude advantage doctrine. At 10:36 hours, he spotted the first Zero formations below at 18,000 feet. The Japanese pilots, accustomed to controlling engagement geometry, found themselves looking up at American fighters for the first time in the war. McCampbell's attack demonstrated the Hellcat's transformation of aerial combat. Diving from 24,000 feet, his division accelerated past 400 miles per hour, a speed where Zeros lost control authority. The American fighters slashed through the Japanese formation, each Hellcat's 6.50 calibers tearing into lightweight enemy aircraft. McCampbell's gun camera footage, later analyzed by Navy intelligence, showed his first Zero disintegrating under a 2-second burst, the pilot having no armor protection against 160 half-inch bullets. The engagement that followed violated every lesson Japanese pilots had learned. When Zeros attempted their traditional turning fights, Hellcat fighters refused to follow, instead using speed to disengage and reposition. When Japanese pilots tried to climb away, Hellcats followed effortlessly, their superior power to weight at high speeds negating the Zero's low-altitude advantages. Lieutenant Alexander Vrakew, flying from USS Lexington, encountered 6 Judy dive bombers escorted by Zeros at 10:52 hours. His after-action report described the new reality. I came down on them at 350 knots. The Zeros couldn't follow my dive speed. I pulled up underneath the first Judy and fired. It exploded immediately. The second and third went down the same way. Their escorts were still above me, trying to dive down, but their aircraft couldn't handle the speed. Vrakew would shoot down 6 enemy aircraft in 8 minutes that morning, his gun camera documenting each kill. The footage showed Japanese aircraft bursting into flames from single bursts, their unprotected fuel systems proving catastrophically vulnerable. Navy analysts watching the film realized they were witnessing the death of Japanese air power. Radio intercepts from Japanese carriers, decoded by Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, revealed panic in enemy communications. At 11:15 hours, large numbers of Grumman fighters, performance exceeds intelligence estimates. At 11:27 hours, request permission to withdraw, cannot maintain formations under enemy attack. At 12:03 hours, most aircraft lost, returning planes critically low on fuel. The statistics documented at battle's end rewrote naval aviation history. American pilots claimed 383 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Post-battle analysis confirmed 270 kills. The remaining claims represented multiple pilots shooting the same aircraft. Against this, Task Force 58 lost 29 Hellcats, with 27 pilots rescued. The kill ratio exceeded 9-1, a complete reversal of early war performance. More significantly, 50 Hellcats returned to their carriers with battle damage that would have destroyed Zeros. Bullet holes in wings, shattered canopies, damaged control surfaces. The armor and redundant systems kept pilots alive and aircraft flying. Maintenance crews documented that 42 of these damaged fighters were repaired and flying again within 24 hours. Japanese survivors rescued from the water provided testimony to Navy intelligence that confirmed the psychological impact. One Zero pilot stated through interpreters, "We were told American fighters were inferior. We were told our training made us invincible. In 5 minutes, I watched every aircraft in my formation shot down. The Americans' aircraft absorbed our fire and kept attacking. Our aircraft exploded from single bursts." The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American pilots immediately dubbed the battle, represented more than tactical victory. It demonstrated that Japanese pilot training could not overcome technological inferiority, that warrior spirit offered no protection against armored cockpits and overwhelming firepower, and that 3 years of American industrial and tactical development had finally delivered the weapon that could dominate the Zero.
The psychological collapse of Japanese naval aviation following the Marianas battle cascaded through every subsequent engagement. By July 1944, Navy intelligence documented a phenomenon unprecedented in the Pacific War. Japanese pilots were avoiding combat with Hellcats whenever possible. Commander Wade McCluskey, analyzing combat reports from July through September 1944, identified a pattern that confirmed the strategic shift. Japanese formations encountering Hellcat patrols increasingly jettisoned bombs and fled rather than engaging. Radio intercepts showed Japanese controllers directing fighters to avoid Grumman aircraft and seek easier targets. The hunter had become the hunted. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in October 1944 demonstrated the Hellcats' complete dominance. During the 4-day engagement, Hellcat squadrons from Task Force 38 destroyed 650 Japanese aircraft while losing 78 of their own, an 8.3-to-1 kill ratio. Commander David McCampbell personally shot down 9 aircraft in a single mission on October 24th, his guns running dry only because he'd expended all 2,400 rounds of ammunition. Japanese tactical adaptations proved futile. They tried attacking from higher altitudes. Hellcats climbed faster and fought better at altitude. They attempted coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Hellcat divisions used superior radio communication and wingman tactics to defeat them. They experimented with new formations. American pilots adapted within single missions, the flexibility of combat-experienced aviators overwhelming rigid Japanese doctrine. The industrial dimension became equally decisive. Grumman production delivered 500 Hellcats monthly by late 1944. Japanese Zero production, meanwhile, collapsed under American bombing and resource shortages. By November 1944, Japan was producing fewer than 200 fighters monthly, and experienced pilots to fly them had become critically scarce. The training pipeline told an even grimmer story for Japan. In 1944, Japanese naval aviation training had degraded catastrophically. New pilots received 100 flight hours before combat assignment, compared to 700 hours in 1941. American pilots, by contrast, received 400 to 600 hours plus specialized combat training. The expertise gap had reversed entirely. Hellcat pilots began noticing the declining quality of enemy opposition by August 1944. After-action reports described enemy pilots making basic errors, flying straight and level during attacks, failing to use defensive maneuvers, breaking formation under pressure. These were symptoms of inadequate training and collapsing morale. The evolution of Hellcat tactics accelerated throughout late 1944. Fighter squadrons developed the thatch-weave offensive variation, where pairs of Hellcats would weave through enemy formations, each protecting the other while maintaining offensive pressure. The high-low tactic positioned one division at altitude while another baited Japanese fighters into climbing, allowing the high division to dive through them. Specialized ammunition loads evolved based on combat experience. By October 1944, standard Hellcat armament included 400 rounds per gun, mixed as follows: 50% armor-piercing incendiary, 25% tracer,
and 25% Standard Ball. This mixture proved devastatingly effective against unarmored Japanese aircraft, with gun camera analysis showing that 2 to 3 second bursts typically resulted in catastrophic fires. The strategic implications transformed American carrier operations. Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet operated with impunity off the Philippines, knowing Hellcat combat air patrols provided near-absolute air superiority. Carrier task forces could position within 100 miles of hostile shores, something inconceivable in 1942, when zero range and performance forced cautious standoff distances. Intelligence reports from captured Japanese documents revealed the enemy's understanding of their situation. A September 1944 Imperial Navy assessment stated, "The F6F fighter has negated all tactical advantages previously held by Zero units. American armor and firepower, combined with improved pilot quality, has created an engagement environment we cannot survive. Current loss rates will eliminate carrier aviation capability within 3 months." The prediction proved accurate. By November 1944, Japanese carrier aviation had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The few remaining experienced pilots were being husbanded for kamikaze missions, a tacit admission that conventional fighter combat against Hellcats was suicide. American dominance extended beyond combat statistics. Hellcat pilots operated with a confidence that affected every decision. They sought combat rather than avoiding it. They pressed attacks knowing their aircraft could absorb damage. They pursued wounded enemies knowing their speed advantage prevented escape. This psychological transformation from defensive survivors to aggressive hunters marked the complete reversal of early war dynamics.
The final accounting of the Hellcats' war against the Zero revealed numbers that redefined aerial combat supremacy. From January 1943 through August 1945, F6F6 Hellcats destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat according to official Navy records. Against this, 270 Hellcats were lost to enemy fighters, a 19-to-1 kill ratio unprecedented in aviation history. The human cost told parallel stories. American pilot losses in Hellcat squadrons decreased by 75% compared to earlier Wildcat operations. Japanese naval aviation, which began the war with 3,500 highly trained carrier pilots, ended it with fewer than 100 experienced aviators. The remainder had been killed in combat against an opponent they could no longer match. Individual achievements illustrated the transformation. The top 10 Hellcat aces collectively shot down 281 enemy aircraft. Commander David McCanwell finished the war with 34 kills, all against Japanese fighters that 3 years earlier had been considered invincible. His survival through dozens of combat missions would have been impossible in a Wildcat. The Hellcat's armor saved his life on at least 7 documented occasions. The moral complexity of this technological triumph appeared in the writings of Hellcat pilots themselves. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, who finished the war with 23 kills, wrote in 1946, "We had advantages they couldn't overcome. Better planes, better training, better support. I shot down pilots who were probably braver than me, but bravery meant nothing against armor plate and 2,000 horsepower. I was grateful for the advantage, but never confused it with superiority as men." Japanese survivors provided testimonies that confirmed the decisive nature of American technical advantages. Captain Minoru Genda, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack and survived the war, stated in 1949, "The Zero's designer achieved perfection within his constraints, but American industry had no constraints. They built fighters that were simultaneously faster, tougher, and more heavily armed. Once the Hellcat appeared, our tactical advantage disappeared." The strategic influence extended far beyond the Pacific. The Hellcat demonstrated that industrial capacity, properly directed by combat analysis, could overcome any initial technical or tactical disadvantage. The Soviet Union studied Hellcat design philosophy when developing post-war fighters. The British incorporated lessons about armor and survivability into their post-war naval aviation. The principles, protect the pilot, deliver overwhelming firepower, accept weight penalties for survivability, became foundational to fighter design. Operation Downfall planning documents from June 1945 reveal how completely the Hellcat had shifted strategic calculations. Invasion planners assumed total American air superiority over Japan based on Hellcat performance. The few remaining Japanese fighters were considered negligible threats. Whether this assumption would have proven correct became moot when atomic weapons ended the war, but the confidence demonstrated how thoroughly the Hellcat had broken Japanese air power. The final missions flown by Hellcats occurred on August 15, 1945, hours before the surrender announcement. Combat air patrols over Tokyo Bay encountered no resistance. Japanese fighters remained grounded, their pilots aware that engaging Hellcats meant certain death for no strategic purpose. The silence in the skies marked the complete psychological defeat that had begun 14 months earlier at the Marianas. The National Museum of Naval Aviation in Pensacola preserves multiple Hellcats, including Commander McCampbell's aircraft. The bullet holes patched in the armor plating, the faded kill markings on the fuselage, the worn gun barrels from thousands of rounds fired, these artifacts testify to the decisive role industrial technology played in modern warfare. The transformation was absolute, from desperate defensive tactics against superior Japanese fighters to complete air dominance through technological innovation. The Zero pilots who had terrorized Allied forces since Pearl Harbor ended the war either dead or flying obsolete aircraft against opponents who hunted them with technological advantages they could not overcome. The lesson the Hellcat taught resonates through military history. In industrial warfare, victory belongs not to the most skilled or the most courageous, but to those who can mass-produce superior weapons and train sufficient numbers to employ them. Japanese pilots discovered that warrior spirit offered no protection against American engineering, that decades of traditional military culture meant nothing against assembly lines producing 500 fighters monthly, and that individual excellence could not overcome systematic technological superiority. Today, the phrase Marianas turkey shoot remains in naval aviation lexicon, shorthand for the kind of one-sided victory that occurs when technical advantage meets combat opportunity. The Hellcat created that opportunity and exploited it with ruthless efficiency, transforming the Pacific War's aerial dimension from contested space to American domain in a single afternoon of combat that stretched across 26 months of subsequent dominance.